Okay, so let's turn to Ecclesiastes then. And this book has had a huge impact on our culture. It's had a huge impact on philosophy, literature, on so many aspects of human experience. Many people outside now of the Christian faith will regard this book as one of the greatest pieces of literature in human civilization. It's an amazing book. It's got a reputation for being a bit negative and a bit depressing. But the subject matter, I guess, is the reason for that. And we're going to look today at the structure of the book. And then we look at its themes. And I'm not sure whether we'll focus on anything specifically, but just perhaps get a feel for the book as a whole. So the book of Ecclesiastes, then, it's a book of wisdom. So it's part of the biblical wisdom tradition, similar to Job in that sense, to Proverbs, to James, as we were looking yesterday at the book of James in the New Testament. It's a book of wisdom. And so wisdom literature in the Bible is concerned about life and the experience of life and how to make sense of life. And wisdom literature needs to be unpacked. It needs to be thought about and reflected on so that it yields up its truth. Ecclesiastes, the title, is a Latin, I think, transliteration of the Hebrew, which means teacher. So it's written under a pseudonym. So the person who writes Ecclesiastes describes himself as the teacher or the assembler or the master. That's the kind of idea, okay? So we're listening to the words of somebody who has reflected on the nature of life. And this person gives the impression of being at the end of his life, having dedicated his life to the achievement of wisdom. So if you look at the book itself, the book usually falls into 3 sections. That's what most people think. The first is short, chapter 1, verse 1, down to verse 11. And this introduction is in the third person, says the preacher. Okay, look at verse 2. So the book is introduced in a way that sets the scene for the preacher to appear. These are quotes, if you like. The first 11 verses are quotes from somebody who has heard the preacher, somebody who may have had conversations with the preacher, who may have been taught by the preacher or the teacher. This person is laying out for us what the thoughts of this preacher are. So that's the first 11 verses. So as you look down, you can see that this person is quoting the preacher or quoting the teacher. So verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. It's almost as if this person who's writing these 11 verses has perhaps listened in a sermon to the teacher and is giving us a resume, a summary of what his teaching is. That's the first 11 verses. Then you get to the main body of Ecclesiastes, and this is delivered to us in the first person, I, the preacher. So take a look at chapter 1, verse 12. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So from verse 12 of chapter 1, all the way through to chapter 12 and verse 8, the preacher talks to us directly. It's this, as I say, this first person conversation between the preacher and us. And then the third section of the book is chapter 12 and verse 9. And we go back to what we had at the beginning, and we have the preacher was wise and the preacher sought. So the person who talked to us at the beginning of the book is talking to us again about the preacher and describing him for us and summing up for us what the preacher's main message is. And of course we get a conclusion then at the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13. let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, this conclusion, as I say, is the conclusion of a pupil, a student, summarizing what his master has taught him. So that's the structure of the book. It's nice and easy. And the debate, of course, is who is this preacher? Who is this teacher? He's a king of Jerusalem. We know that much. Traditionally, it's understood to be Solomon. But then, as you'd expect, these days of biblical scholarship, there is now a school of thought that says, no, this isn't Solomon, it's somebody else. But that's exactly what you'd expect from modern scholarship. So there's the structure then of the book of Ecclesiastes. What I want us to do now is look at the content, if you like, look at the themes of this book. And the first thing to observe is this is an observational account. This preacher-teacher has set himself to observe. And so what you get again and again and again is the phrase, I have seen, I have observed, I dedicated myself, I turned. So this is the whole thrust of the book. This person has deliberately set out to observe life and to notice what perhaps doesn't seem obvious. He notices perhaps what people don't want to see for themselves. So if you look at chapter 2 and verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you. So he's going to look at the subject of laughter. And then verse 12, I turned myself to consider wisdom. And as you go through the book, you'll see these statements about him observing. Look at chapter 5 and verse 18. Here is what I have seen. You can go back into chapter 4 and verse 4, and you get the same idea. Again, I saw that for all toil and so on. If you go to chapter 7 and verse 15, you have the same idea. I have seen everything in my days. And one more example, chapter 8 and verse 9, all this I have seen. So it's really important to notice that this is an observational account. It's almost as if this king has set himself out to be a spectator, to be a little bit distant from all that is going on around him, and to set himself up to make observations of life. And what we have in this preacher's account is a series of things, subjects, that he has been observing. And it's a long list. So he has observed himself, and he has sought to have one of the most wonderful things we can ever have into ourselves, and that is insight. And I would really love to talk about insight if we can at some point. So he's observed himself. He's observed himself when he's happy. He's observed himself when he's sad. He's observed himself when he's doing well and he's successful. He's observed himself when he's less successful. He's observed the luxuries that he's been able to enjoy. It's been very important for him to have insight into himself. He's also observed other people. He's looked at their lives. So chapter 4 is an account of his observations on the lives of others. We saw chapter 1, he's observed himself. Then what he loves to do is to observe time. And what is time like? How does time itself work? And so one of the most important sections, one of the ones we know most, I guess, is chapter 3, which consists of his observations on the nature of time. It's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant. And what he's telling us there is that no time is permanent. There is nothing that we can ever experience that will remain the same. Change is part and parcel of human experience. So the times that we enjoy will not remain, and the times that we struggle either will not remain. And so he has this very profound observation on the relativity of time. Now that's very modern, isn't it? Time can pass slowly, time can pass quickly. Time isn't experienced by us all in exactly the same way. We have different experiences of time depending on certain conditions, if you like. So he observes the nature of time. Chapter 3, in chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 9, he observes wisdom. And he asks questions about wisdom. And he asks the question, is it better to be a wise person or a foolish person? Because when you consider both, they both come to the same conclusion, don't they? And, that's not very cheerful. So the wise person, his time will pass. The foolish person, his time will pass. So he reflects on the value of being wise. And as you plow through these chapters, he'll reflect on youth and old age. He'll reflect on riches and poverty, life and death, success and failure. He'll reflect on the monarchy and what is it like to be a king? What is it like to be under the rule of a king? Is it a good thing? Depending on what the king is like, I guess, he says to us. So here are his observations, okay? So we have a very unique insight into the experience of life. That's the first thing to say about the book of Ecclesiastes. It's observational. What then happens is he tells us that having observed all these things, he can tell us some truth about life. He is able to tell us the truth about human existence. And that truth is unwelcome. That truth he recognizes people don't want to hear, but it's the thing that the book is most famous for. And the truth about life is that all is vanity. So there you go. We've said the word. Let's take a look. Chapter 1, verse 2. So this student, this other person who's talking to us about the teacher, the thing that he remembers most about the teacher is that the teacher has said, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now we'll talk about that word in a moment. Let's see what the preacher himself says then. Chapter 9 and verse 9. Because he's saying again that all the days of your life are vanity. Chapter 9, verse 9. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he, God, has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity, for that is the portion in life. So there's vanity, okay? Chapter 11, and we've got, I think, in chapter 11, verse 8, if a man lives many years and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Now, I hope you're still with me, guys, okay? Vanity. Chapter 12 and verse 8, this is the final word of our preacher now, and he echoes what we've already heard. Vanity of vanity, all is vanity, says the preacher. So there it is, okay? That's his truth. The truth of human experience, having considered all these aspects of life, that's the conclusion that he comes to. And the word vanity has to be thought about very carefully, and many people will give you different meanings for the word. Some people think it means empty. Other people think the word means meaningless, pointless, transient, passing. Okay, so there's a huge conversation around what the word itself means. For me, the word is best summed up by the term existentialism. Okay, existentialism is a very modern philosophical idea. It's not so popular today as it used to be. existentialism tells us that life and engaging in life can seem absurd. And the word that I would use for vanity from the Hebrew is absurd. You work hard, but for what? You build up your business and then you have to hand it over to somebody who could destroy it. You work hard somewhere, for example, in an office, in a school. You work hard perhaps in a church. You work there, and then somebody new comes along and all your work is undone. Nothing remains. If you have riches, but they don't satisfy you. You can have servants, but you still don't feel fulfilled. It's the absurd nature, the absurdity of what we do and get so excited about and spend all our energies on, and yet none of it will last. It's absurd. So there's a very strong school of thought today that thinks the word vanity is best understood by this English term absurd. It's an insight into the human condition, that everything that we seem to be exercised about, that we want to be successful at, does not last. And this is the major impact that this book has had outside of Christian circles, I guess. It's on the transient, the passing nature of human achievement. And it asks us, it asks us to question, why do we get so excited about and stressed about and involved in things that ultimately will not matter? And nothing will be left. There will be no permanent marker after we've gone to show what we've done. This is the kind of insight now that our little chap, the preacher, is coming to. Now, I hope you don't feel discouraged by it, okay? Because he is very well aware that people don't want to hear, that we want to be caught up in life, we want to be building our business, we want to be going about our affairs, and we don't want anybody coming along and asking this one question that can be summed up in one word, and it's a very devastating word, and it's the word why. Why are you doing this? Why are you so caught up in what you're doing? One day you won't be there, and when you're not there, will your job cease? Will the building fall down? Will the church crumble? No, it'll all carry on like it always has. So why? And that's what this guy does. He almost forces us to consider the why of life. What's the reason behind it all? What's motivating you? So that's his major conclusion then. But he's also got another kind of truth he wants to tell us. And this truth is about the nature of wisdom itself. So don't forget now, this is a book of wisdom. And what he wants us to be very clear about is you will lead a happier life if you're not wise. Because what wisdom will bring you is grief. Now, what a thing to say. Chapter 1, and we'll read verses 16, 17, and 18. Okay, chapter 1, verses 16, 17, and 18. I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is grasping for the wind. And sometimes vanity can be translated as the wind. Here's the verse. For in much wisdom is much grief. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So this is his truth then, okay? That life itself, so that's the big picture, life for everyone, he doesn't just mean himself, it's a judgment about life as life is vanity. But then wisdom, the person who seeks to be wise, is going to have a very tough time. And the more you know, the more you'll sorrow. And the wiser you are, the more of a burden that will be. Now, this chap is really cheerful, but then he's considering some very difficult things, isn't he? So we've got observation, then he tells us the truth. So if we wanted advice from our teacher, what would his advice be? And he's got 3 pieces of advice to give us. And this advice has to be thought about very carefully. So his first piece of advice is, what should you do yourself? Okay, what would he advise us to do as individuals? And this is a very well-known piece of advice. It has not just remained in the book of Ecclesiastes. This piece of advice is going to get taken up by the Apostle Paul, and we'll see it on Wednesday when we do our next book. Paul's advice to the individual. Shall we take a look at it, see what you make of it? Turn to chapter 5. And chapter 5, verse 18, individual advice. Here is what I have seen. It is good, so this is the man giving you advice now. It is good and fitting for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all he labors, in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him. For this is his lot. Eat, drink, and be merry. Chapter 8 and verse 15. So I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat and drink and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God has given him under the sun. Now, those of you who are really good Bible students will know that what we've got here is repetition. He is virtually identically quoting the verse twice. Eat, drink, and be merry, I have observed, because it is God-given. God gives you the good things of life. He gives you today. He gives you this moment. He gives you this moment, the fruits of your labor. He gives you hard work and the benefits of hard work. That's what he commends. Now, perhaps we'll talk a little bit more about how people have misused the book of Ecclesiastes. But if you engage with Ecclesiastes honestly, this is what his advice is to you as an individual. Enjoy life. Enjoy what life has to offer you. Make the most of your daily experiences. What is good in one day, seek to enjoy it to its uttermost. Get the most out of every day, okay? That's his advice to you individually. Then he's got some advice to give us about relationships. And to the preacher and the teacher, relationships are hugely important. The thing that gives life meaning, that makes life less absurd, are relationships. So chapter 4 and verse 9. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. And a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. That last phrase, a 3-fold cord, is gone into our culture and our language. It's a proverbial statement. So 2 are better than 1. So his advice is to have good relationships and to make the most of your relationships and to seek out relationships, because life is better when you're not 1. Life is better when you are 2. So this is advice about relationships, but he also says things that I think are very interesting about relationships. And I kind of won't point out everything to you, but I'll let you kind of discover it for yourself. But look at what he says here in chapter 7 and verse 21. Chapter 7 and verse 21. What a wonderful advice this is. Do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that you have cursed others. Now that's just great, isn't it? Don't worry about what people say about you. Don't worry about what they think about you, because you know very well that you have said things about other people. And so if you say things about other people, should you be exempt then from other people saying things about you? Take no notice, pay no attention to what other people think of you. But in the middle of that he's saying something hugely important, okay? And it's about the subject of insight. Did you notice it? So turn to chapter 7 again, and there it is in verse 22. For many times your own heart has known that even you cursed others. Now there is the preacher capturing what insight is. Insight is your own heart has known, knowing your own heart, having understanding of what you like, of how you are, having an understanding of your own self and your own behavior and of your own weaknesses, having insight into your own condition. And for the preacher, that's hugely important. It's an aspect of wisdom that we should be open to and honest with ourselves, so that we understand what we are like and we can be honest. Now, I'm going to say what I said yesterday to you, okay? And after all these years of being a minister, I wish some people had insight into themselves, because so many problems are caused when we lack insight into ourselves, when we just are completely blind and completely closed to self-understanding. And some people go through life without any insight at all into what they're like, into how they work, into what their weaknesses are, into their struggles, into their faults. Some people just blindly go through life, causing chaos for themselves and harm to others because of a lack of insight. And this preacher, this guy, is hugely, hugely, hugely interested in insight, having that willingness to be honest with themselves, to look at yourself, to be interested in the truth about yourself, even if that hurts, if it's uncomfortable, if it's challenging. That's what he holds out for us as one of the great uses of wisdom, giving us insight into ourselves. And that's the mission that this man had. So insight, tremendously important. If a person lacks insight, that person will never grow, never change, never get better. The same mistakes will be made. The same harmful habits will be maintained. And the same problems will crop up in that person's life. 30 years down the line, they'll be the same as they were 30 years ago, because there is an absence of insight. And of course, the great question is, are we all capable of insight? Can we, all of us, whoever we are, have an honest understanding of ourselves? Can we? Well, this is what our guy is very keen on, okay? So he gives advice to the individual. He then gives advice about relationships. He says relationships are tremendously important, but he says, don't be surprised if in relationships you get treated in the way that you yourself have behaved. That shouldn't surprise you, okay? Relationships. And then the third piece of advice that our friend gives us is in relation to God. And these are, again, are very, very well-known verses. We quoted one from the person who's observing the preacher, says as a conclusion, chapter 12, verse 13, fear God and keep his commandments. Verse 1 of chapter 12, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. The words that he uses, fear, that's been said before. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We've had that in Proverbs. Fear here doesn't mean to be afraid. I'm sure we all know that, don't we? The word fear is closely linked to the word worship. It's closely linked to the word glory. It's got the sense of weight. So the Greek word for glory is a word that means heaviness. It means substance. It means depth. And that's what you've got here. Fear means to worship, to reverence, to pay respect, to honor. It's a very weighty, serious word that we should have. And then remember, well, of course, he's been reflecting on the whole idea of memory and having a heritage and people thinking of you after you've gone. Does your work remain? Does it last? Is there anything permanent in our achievements? He's been thinking about all of that. So he says, look, the only thing that will last is your relationship with God. The only thing that will endure and continue is your relationship with the Creator. And that's the great permanent thing in life, because God himself is permanent, and who he is and what he does is permanent. So move from all that which is temporary, go from all that which is passing, and focus your attention all the days of your life on that which will never ever fade, and that is God himself and who he is. That's his advice. So one more thing I think we could say about this book, for today at least, and that's the repetition of the phrase, under the sun. And you could, if you wanted to, go through this book and just note how often you get the phrase, under the sun. And what our friend does, at least, I guess, more than anything else, is say that evil is under the sun and that vanity is under the sun. And what I want you to think about is, what does this phrase, under the sun, mean? Evil under the sun has become another frequent, common phrase. Agatha Christie used it, didn't she, for the title of one of her books. You've got evil under the sun in chapter 4, verse 7, chapter 5, verse 13, chapter 10, verse 5, evil under the sun. And if you just look at one example, chapter 6, and the first verse. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. Now then, what does that phrase mean? Okay, and when he uses it and he repeats it as he does, then what's his great emphasis, do you think? What does he mean? So this book is not an easy book. It is something that you have to think about very carefully and then say, okay, where's the positive here? Okay. And we always end, don't we, with thinking about how we can be encouraged, because all scripture is given for. So what's the encouragement here? And to me, the encouragement of this book is the permanence, the everlasting nature of who God is, and how if we focus our attention there, we will never experience vanity. Vanity and feelings of it's all pointless. You might feel that anywhere else. Okay, that could be experienced in any area of life, but where you'll never know anything that is vanity is in God and your relationship with him and what it is that he is doing. And so it's about perspective. When you're caught up in the day, or you're caught up in a struggle, or you're having a tough time, that time will pass. When you are getting so immersed in work or busyness, then to remind yourself that this isn't permanent, that this won't last, that you will one day retire and it'll be like you've never been there, that is a good thing. Okay, that's what wisdom will say to you. It's a good thing because it gives you perspective. So if you want a word that can be helpful from the book of Ecclesiastes, it's a variation on the word observe. It's perspective. It's about putting life in perspective, but it's also about having a perspective on yourself, being able to understand yourself and make sense of yourself and have that insight into yourself, which then enables you to grow. So it's not an easy book, and I'm going to be very keen to hear your thoughts.